Try to tell teenagers to get off their phones or to do something that's not on their screen, and you'll quickly find out how attached to the online world they can be. And while that can have its upside, it also means they're exposed to some pretty awful content. With us now on how to talk to teens about things such as racism and pornography that they will inevitably encounter online, we welcome, in the nation's capital, Purnima Sundar, Executive Director at the Knowledge Institute on Child and Youth Mental Health and Addictions. And in Amherstburg in southwestern Ontario, Cara Brisson-Boivin, Director of Research at the digital and media literacy nonprofit organization called Media Smarts. And we welcome both of you to our program today, and I guess we should start here. Cara, I want to share your numbers with our audience. These are from Media Smart, their latest report. So Sheldon, if we can, let's bring these graphics up here and tell you what kids think about this stuff. Violent, racist, sexist online content. 47% of Canadians aged 12 to 17 report seeing racist or sexist content online at least once a week. LGBTQ plus youth and young people with a disability are more likely to see it. 88% of youth agree it's important to speak up about harmful content, but 58% feel they don't know what to say. This data, incidentally, collected during the COVID pandemic as part of Media Smart's fourth phase of the Young Canadians in a Wireless World study. Okay, Cara, get us started here. In which online spaces are young people running into this content most frequently?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to recognize, as you highlighted, this study is part of MediaSmart's longest-running, most comprehensive study that examines young people's lives online. And in part of that work, in this phase, we discovered that the primary motivation for young people being online is social connection. So, not surprisingly, they're mostly, engaging in social spaces, social networks. The top 5 platforms they indicated were YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter.
Well, that's the whole gamut there. You can't very well keep them off that, can you?
Oh, I mean, and I think it is important to recognize that because social connection is the heart of their motivation, and of course that we collected this data at the peak of the pandemic, this was where young people were living, playing, connecting, doing schoolwork. So, it's not surprising that they want to be there. And in many ways, they do need to be there. It's where they are learning and growing.
Having said that, Purnima, we hear in this study that LGBTQ plus and young people with disabilities are more likely to see racist and sexist content. Why would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just increased exposure means increased potential to be exposed to a number of unsettling images, unsettling messages, and so on. And so, as Cara said, young people during the pandemic were just online a whole lot more for school, for socializing, for recreation. And I think that when you have young people that have diverse identities, they're seeking connection. So some of these safe spaces to be with other young people, give and get peer support, socialize with people with shared kind of interests and experiences. They're also looking for information on health and sexual health and mental health. And, the internet can be great places to find that kind of information and connection, but they can also, these searches also influence algorithms in a way that can drive young people to experience more unsavory content. And we know that there is significant research on how these online platforms and technology are designed to amplify some of these inequities and online harms. It's designed to get more views, more engagements, and ultimately profit those that are running these sites. And these young people are particularly vulnerable to that discrimination.
Cara, while we know that young people are quite capable of being quite miserable to each other online, I wonder how much of this is that and how much of it is adults behaving badly.
Yeah, I think it's an important distinction. And, I think, one of the things that we found both in this study and it mimics what we found in our online hate research is that often young people were flagging that they are operating in what they perceive to be adult spaces with adult created problems. And more often than not, the kinds of content, the kinds of racist and sexist, misogynist, low levels of prejudice that percolate in these spaces from their perspective are coming from the adults in these spaces. And it's important because what we found is that it tends to have the kind of consequence where young people feel less inclined to intervene because they don't necessarily feel they have a right or a voice in these spaces. So that's really problematic. And one of the things that we've been doing is really trying to work to empower youth, to reassure them that they have a right to be in these spaces, they have a voice that they absolutely ought to use. Because we did find that, one young person or one person intervening does have a ripple effect, especially for youth who hold their peer groups understandably so close and in such high regard. So yeah, it's really important, that consequence, that the potential for young people to be less likely to intervene is something that I think we all need to take into consideration.
Purnima, I really am trying to get my head around what kind of adult thinks it's useful to spend their time trolling 12-year-olds with this kind of crap. Who does that?
It's a good question, Steve. I think, we are living in a time where a lot of this kind of behavior has been normalized. Unfortunately, we're living in contexts where the pandemic has had a huge impact on everybody across all age ranges. And I think that it's created some conditions that make it so that, unfortunately, adults are not behaving in ways that we would hope to be role modeling good technological behavior with young people. So it's a difficult time. It's a stressful time, and I think one of the things that we know is that the impact on young people is very detrimental. It has a really terrible impact on young people's mental health. We see poor mental health outcomes across all ages when young people experience discrimination, whether that's live and in person or online. And I think the other added piece about the online opportunity to influence young people is that this is all anonymous, and so adults who are behaving in this way or young people who are behaving in negative ways online, there's a certain level of anonymity there that protects them from any kind of negative consequence. So, as Kara said, it's really important that we intervene as early as possible whenever young people are exposed to this kind of discriminatory content, to encourage them to act, encourage them to talk to their parents or caregivers, talk to teachers, talk to one another, and make sure that we sort of nip this in the bud.
Yeah, everybody's very brave when they can say whatever they want anonymously on social media. I've noticed that over the years. Kara, how about this? Your study did point out that young people do believe that they should do something, and they would like to do something when they see this kind of foul content. But perhaps you could give them some advice on what they ought to do. They're not quite sure what to do, so what should they do?
Yeah, and I think Purnima hit it on the head with, as soon as we possibly can to provide youth with the tools to respectfully and safely engage. And that is something that Media Smarts has done. We have a resource on our website called My Voice is Louder Than Hate. It is an interactive multimedia platform designed for youth. It can be used by educators in the classroom, but also other parents and adults who are just working and want to support young people to push back and intervene. And a couple just takeaways from that. We often remind young people, and what we found from this research is that you can call in rather than call out. And by that, we mean most youth prefer to take a conversation offline or into private messaging, to speak to a person in private in a way that really de-escalates the situation. Similarly, speaking to the content rather than the poster, another way to de-escalate, because of course, understandably, young people, are very cognizant of wanting to not draw unwanted attention to themselves, not want to draw themselves into situations that they don't necessarily want to be in. And then lastly, one of the things we discovered in our work was young people, want to respond in and through humor. And so part of this platform allows them to design memes. It's a creative way that they can push back, intervene, and communicate quite literally through, the kind of tools of their generation, so to speak.
Purnima, can you add to that? Does humor really disarm under these circumstances?
I want to underscore what Kara said about the calling in versus calling out. I think that's one of the ways that helps people to feel a bit more safe when they're trying to engage in a conversation that is not necessarily publicly embarrassing or taking somebody down in a more public way. I do think that humor is helpful, and so trying to turn it into a less serious sort of consequence for the individual while still making that point that this is unacceptable and that we need to pull back, I think has been shown to be quite effective. Yes.
Okay, let's do one more survey here. And Sheldon, I'm going to ask you to put up this next graphic because Media Smarts also asked Canadian young people, grades 7 to 11, about viewing pornography online. And here's what the numbers had to say about that. 42% of youth surveyed said they try to avoid seeing pornography. 22% say they have looked for it. 32% say they have seen pornography online without looking for it. The majority reported they were just 9 years old or older when they first looked for pornography online. Okay, Kara, I've got to start with this. How reliable do you think these answers are?
Well, I think first of all, we ought to take the young people who engage in this survey, for their word. That I think young people are the experts in their own lives. However, it was a small sample of our larger population. We did ask it only to the older youth in the survey, and then of course it was only those who indicated that they had seen or were looking for pornography. So it's a small sample, and I think we should take that into consideration and not make any massive generalizations. But at the same time, I think we're finding some interesting trends here that are worth paying attention to. First and foremost, that I think which pushes against a lot of our sort of adults conceived stereotypes about young people is that they aren't necessarily actively seeking this out in large numbers. In fact, they're more likely to be trying to avoid stumbling upon this content unintentionally in their online engagements.
Well, let me follow up on that because we know that when it comes to which political party would you vote for in an election, which is not necessarily an embarrassing question, we know that there are adults who lie to pollsters about that information. Now you're asking young people about how much porn they survey. That's an even more delicate subject matter than which political party would you vote for. So I sort of okay, Purnima, let me go to you on this. Do you have any reason to dispute that the young people who said, no, I don't look for porn and I'm not surveying for it online, do we really believe them?
I would. I think that these surveys are conducted or completed under the understanding that they're sharing responses that are going to be kept confidential. So I think that and I would trust that Media Smarts has done their due diligence in terms of explaining the methodology to the young people. I wouldn't have any reason to dispute what young people are saying. I do, though, would emphasize that this is again, it's increased exposure means increased opportunity to stumble upon something like this. What we also know is that if you have adults who are involved and supervising young people's use of media, that is actually related to a decrease in stumbling upon these kinds of images and disturbing sorts of content online. So, again, your children and what they're sort of up to online. If you know what they're up to online, it's more likely that they're not going to stumble upon something like this.
Well, listen, my hunch is that most parents don't know what their kids are doing online, which is, why we're trying to do a bit of a deep dive on this here. And Kara, I'll follow up with this. A third of the teens said they saw pornography inadvertently online without looking for it. How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, primarily from what they've told us, it's on popping up on the websites that they're visiting, in search engines, and a very small, about 24% of youth said it, was sent to them by friends. And I just think it's really important to keep this in mind because, for a young person to go to a trusted adult in their life, whether it's a parent or guardian or anybody else, and say, this is on my screen, I don't know what to do about it, it's very uncomfortable for them. And so we do need to keep that in mind, that it's more likely that this has popped up, that they've accidentally stumbled upon it because of a poor use of search terms, as opposed to actively seeking it out. And to Purnima's point, all the more reason why adults and parents, guardians, we need to be prepared and ready to both help our young people navigate these spaces and, figure out the tools that are available to them to help mitigate this, but also to be ready and open and willing to have these conversations at as young an age as possible to prepare them for the inevitability that if they're online, as Purnima said, there is a likelihood that they are going to encounter this content. And we need to, again, have an open conversation about that. So youth feel they have trusted networks of support to turn to. We did hear in this study that the number one recourse for young people when they come across content that makes them uncomfortable is to go to their parents and guardians and talk about it.
In which case, Purnima, let's get some advice on this, particularly if young people as young as 9 are either already looking for this or are inadvertently, bumping into it on the internet. If parents want to be proactive, how do you begin to introduce this subject, to talk to your kids about it?
Yeah, I think, the Canadian Pediatric Society has created a helpful kind of set of what they call 4 M's. So their advice to parents and caregivers is to, first of all, help to manage the use. So again, increased exposure means increased likelihood that young people are going to come across these kinds of things. So manage the amount of use of social media that your children are engaging in, and shape those rules as a family. So young people are much more likely to follow the rules if they feel like they've had an opportunity to influence those as well. So examples could include keeping the door open when you're using your screen as a child, or using them in common spaces. I think as parents, talking to your kids about what sites you should and shouldn't be visiting, I think being open about that is really important. The second M is about making it meaningful. So using technology not just for surfing and for watching TikTok videos and so on, but using it in positive ways. So looking up recipes as a family, and engaging in shared activities and using technology to help facilitate that. The third M is around modeling moderation. So, as an adult, you really can't ask your kids to follow rules that you yourself don't follow. And so, as a family, no devices at meal times, no devices during family times, no devices. This is a big one. No devices in the bedroom overnight, because that's when young people are much more likely to be drawn to looking at their phone. So keep it someplace neutral where your young person isn't going to get at it in the middle of the night. And also encouraging play and screen-free time. And finally, just monitoring. So continuing to monitor and implement those rules in an ongoing kind of way. So it's not sufficient just to create the rules. You do have to be following up and keeping those lines of communication open with the young people in your life.
And Kara, I presume taking the approach of woe betide you if I ever catch you surfing porn is not the way to go.
No, and I just love Purnima brought up the 4 M's. Media Smarts was working with the Canadian Pediatric Society on those. So those are exactly like we would, of course, emphasize that approach. And precisely, not necessarily the way to go. Again, I think having open lines of communication are critically important for young people to feel that they have the network of support they need in their lives. We hear consistently from young people in our work, they want to know that, the adults in their lives have their backs, but that they're not hovering over their shoulders.
Having said that, Purnima, I know enough young people, I've had a few live in my home with me, to know that look, they're devious. They're going to do whatever they can to sneak around behind their parents' back and, take a look at screens in off hours when they're not supposed to, and all of that kind of stuff. How far should we be prepared to go to sort of enforce these kinds of rules, which we know are in their long-range best interests, but which perhaps they don't know in the short run are in their long-range best interests?
Yeah, I think that this depends on the family, the way that the family operates. So these kinds of issues are not independent of, they sort of go along with the way that we handle as families all other issues, right? And so I think consequences for actions, I think a non-judgmental approach to managing your child's behavior, working to problem solve together. Those are all ways that you can try and help respond when and if they do break those rules. I think another sort of thing, I can speak as a parent. One of the things that we've done in our house is we have passwords listed somewhere in the house so that anybody can sort of access somebody's cell phone if necessary. And we don't do that regularly. We don't sort of try and review and surveil our kids' activities necessarily, but we could. And even just having that in the back of your child's mind to say, my parents might actually see this, that can be a big deterrent. And so I think that, establishing rules in your family, establishing ways of being in your family that are positive, strengths oriented. And, again, you're right, Steve, kids will break those rules sometimes, but it's about how you approach those circumstances and try and ensure that they don't happen again. And I think engaging young people in developing those rules is really an important first step.
Kara, last 30 seconds to you on establishing and enforcing those household rules.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Purnima has said. Organically created as a family, including the young people in that family, in the creation and establishment of those rules and holding each other accountable. That's what we've heard time and time again has been the best recipe for success. So, it also means, as Purnima has said, that us as adults, as parents, I'll hold myself to that as well. We need to be held to the same standards that we expect of the young people in our lives.
Terrific. Kara Brisson-Boyven from Media Smarts and Purnima Sundar from the Knowledge Institute on Children and Youth and Mental Health and Addictions. It's good of both of you to join us here on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.